Hey, what's going on, guys? How's everybody doing? So over the holiday weekend, I was doing a little bit of research, a little bit of testing, and a little bit of video watching all about Albedo. I wanted to see what people thought about him, and overall, could I change my own builds and what people thought about his builds in general. And I kept seeing a lot of people saying to go and build him for defense, and I was wondering, why is that the case? Am I missing something? So I ran a whole bunch of tests, and I still don't understand it. I think there's this trap. It started with Noelle, right? Noelle is actually good and scales with her defense quite well, especially when you're using her as a carry and using her with her burst in mind. But then we get Jinyan, right? And Jinyan's shields do not scale very well off of defense. Really, she's like a physical carry build. Now we come to Albedo, whose skill scales off of defense. And overall, I think this is a huge trap. Today, we're going to go over why I think it's a huge trap, why you should definitely not build your Albedo for defense specifically. It's okay to have it as a substat because it will help you out, but focusing on defense for Albedo is a huge trap, and we're going to go over exactly why in today's video. But first, I do kind of just want to give my overall impressions so far of Albedo, because I'm sure people will ask me that, and I'm not going to really have a dedicated video to that for this hero. So my initial thought was actually pretty funny. I actually thought Albedo was pure garbage, and I think a lot of that has to come to do with the fact that he was right after Zhongli. So a big problem that I had with Zhongli is that I was hoping he was going to be more of a supporting build. I know everyone wanted him to be this god carry DPS monster, which he wasn't really. He's fine, but then as far as support, they took away a lot of his supporting elements on his burst. His skill didn't really recharge energy that great, and that was really the key thing, right? Because he wasn't a great support and he had like RNG energy recharge, it really put a damper on his ability as a support unit. So here comes Albedo, right? And we start using a skill, and oh, look at that. We got another gotcha mechanic. We got RNG energy recharge. And I was rip-roaring mad. I was so pissed that they did this 2 times in a row, gave us this random energy recharge support character. I was like, Geo is one of the weaker elements in this game currently. And right now, with Ningguang and the main character really being the only 2 batteries you have in the game, it would have been nice to have Albedo be consistent. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that that's kind of a silly thought to have, right? So if we think about Albedo's skill, right, it stays on the field for 30 seconds, and we have random energy recharge, right? But there's another character who's actually top tier who performs very similarly, and no one thinks twice about it, right? So I'm talking about Fischl. So Fischl's Oz stays on the field for 25 seconds, and it also has random energy recharge. But no one really questions that and says it's bad. So I thought about it, and it's actually not that bad that Albedo has random energy recharge, especially since it is fairly consistent. To me, it seems like 60 to 70-ish% of the time you get hits with his skill, you're going to be generating energy. So the fact that he can do consistent and pretty good damage while he's off the field, as opposed to Zhongli, whose damage while he's off the field is overall pretty weak, it makes him a much better Geo support character. So overall, I have been very impressed with Albedo. For me, he kind of feels like a combination of Fischl and Xingqiu, but with a Geo element. Overall, I do think he is quite good, and he could also potentially become much better in the future with the potential buffs that MiHoYo is testing out for the Geo Resonance and for the Geo class overall. But yeah, that's my overall thoughts. So let's go ahead, take a look at some numbers and see why his skill going into defense primarily is a trap. All right, now on your screen here, you can see a tool we are becoming all too familiar with. That is the Genshin Impact Calculator. This tool is incredible. I'll link it below down in the description. But basically what we're going to be doing is taking a look at 2 very simplistic builds for Albedo, because the fact is it's very hard to test for a variety of builds because substats are going to change and there's a lot of different factors that could come into play. So what we're going to be doing is comparing 2 very basic builds. So we're going to have skill and burst both level 6, as that's pretty much the recommended level, especially when you're going like free to play or mid-tier level player. Once you start getting into those gold books, it starts getting very expensive. We're looking at Festering Desire as our weapon of choice for this. First of all, you get all the refinements for free, so we can get a bunch of passive boosts on that, plus the fact that you can also get 1.5 times the weapon experience for this, so it's actually a very good time to level this up as a 4-star weapon for your arsenal. Now, in looking at his artifact sets, we do have to change these up a little bit in order to try and keep them consistent across both his skill and burst builds. So for my burst builds, I do have him on a 2-piece Noblesse Oblige set, and because that's going to give him a burst damage increase, and on the skill builds it wouldn't, we're going to put that on Gambler. Now, you might be saying, well, but Gambler only maxes out at 4 stars, so we're going to see a stat loss. Yes, but what I've done is put the Gambler pieces on pieces that don't matter for his damage output. So we have those on his Feather and Flower. Since his skill doesn't scale with attack or HP in any way, we're only looking at the damage coming from his defense. And finally, you'll notice that we do have a crit percent and crit damage at about 50 and 100% respectively. I think it's important to take into account crits, as most of the time, once you get into the later game, you are going to want to build your sets for crit specifically. So because of that, I just threw 50% and 100% on here, just through substats. Obviously, that's going to be a little bit harder to hit without a main stat circlet. But for testing purposes, we're just looking at raw numbers here. So take that into account as well. So for his skill damage, we're looking at 6,700 for every use and almost 7,200 for every Blossom proc. Now, these are average DPS numbers. We're not using the base attack or the crit numbers because over time they'll average out. So we are using the orange numbers on the right that you'll see there. So let's compare the potential damage we can get in 12 seconds, as this is the cooldown of Albedo's burst. So we want to compare how much damage we can do in that 12-second time span. So with a cooldown of 4 seconds, we can use a skill 3 times within a 12-second time span. This is going to average us 20.1k damage, roughly. And we can proc a Blossom every 2 seconds whenever we damage an enemy. So this is going to result in 42.2k damage. But that's also hitting procs perfectly because remember, it's every 2 seconds. So if you get one at like 2.1, the max amount of procs you could get within that 12-second window is 5 procs. So if you were to only hit 5, our DPS drops down to 36k from 42.2. Leaving our total average between 56 and 62k every 12 seconds. Now, when we move over to our burst focus build, remember, we've changed our Gambler pieces for Noblesse Oblige, but we didn't end up affecting any of our attack percents or geo percents. So because we have the equivalent 20% boost damage, this is all fine. We've kept our percentages the same. We've also changed our timepiece and circlet from defense over to attack. And keep in mind, before we do any calculations on this build, that we're still using Festering Desire, and that is actually going to hinder our damage on our burst build, or actually not necessarily hinder, but it's going to help out our skill version because the passive is only affecting our skill damage and skill crit rate. So keep that in mind when we do these calcs, that the skill version is actually getting a little bit of help. So taking a look at damage on our burst build, we're getting an average of 26k from his burst damage. And what's important to note here is that this can hit multiple enemies. So for argument's sake, let's just say this is hitting 1 to 2 enemies, but of course we can get more. I've seen on my personal builds hit 3 to 4, but again, that depends on grouping, and because that's not super consistent, we're going to go with 1 to 2. So we're looking at 26k to 52k. Then we have the Fatal Blossoms, which, as calculated before on the skill, these are also AoE, so they can hit multiple targets, but we're going to assume that we're only hitting 1 target at a time, just for simplicity's sake. On average, these are each hitting 5.1k damage, so over the course of 7 Blossoms, you're looking at 35.5k. So when we add these together, we're looking at an average of 57.5 to 87.5 thousand damage in the same time frame, which is actually quite significantly more. Even on the bottom end of the scale for your burst, you're still hitting roughly the same amount as the skill. Now, when we do consider that both the skill and burst can hit multiple enemies, it's going to be much easier to do a lot more damage with his burst than it is his skill. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that it's also much easier to increase attack percent than defense percent. So looking on screen here, we got 2 different pairings. We got the Geo pairing and we got the Pyro pairing. Looking at their elemental resonances, you know, Pyro, we know, gives an increase in attack by 25%. And currently, Enduring Rock, the Geo resonance, is giving a 15% attack damage increase that will be changing in the future. But both of these are going to give overall more of a boost to his burst than it will to his skill. So That's one thing to keep in mind, is that it's much easier to raise the damage of his burst through that. The other thing to keep in mind is if we're looking at weapons, it's actually much easier for him to scale his burst because of your base attack, right? When we look at weapons overall, it's going to be much easier. For example, like if you put a flute on him, he's going to get attack percentage from that. And once we start moving into 5-star weapons, if we ever do, your base attack table is going to be increased. So it's going to be much easier to get higher percentages from his attack percent because your base attack is going to be so much higher than it would be on a 3 or 4-star sword. And I'm sure there may be some people who will ask about this, even though I'm sure these people will be in the minority because it will cost a lot to get him to this point. But what about Albedo C2? Because his C2 does increase the damage of his burst and his skill by 30% of his defense with up to 4 stacks. So in my opinion, it is still not worth it to build for defense in this case. The reason being is if you're building him for defense, you're taking away some of his attack percentages. So you're kind of doing one of these things, right? And it's going to average out in the end. But overall, because this is based on his defense, and again, because we talked about how it's harder to build defense going into the later game and it's way easier to scale attack, you're going to get overall more benefits in building attack, and it's going to scale way easier than it would be if you were building into defense. But guys, those are my overall thoughts on why I think building Albedo into defense specifically is a trap. You know, hopefully you guys caught this and you realize that it's really just not as effective to build him into defense. Granted, it is cheaper because you don't necessarily need a high level weapon, so you don't scale his attack, but for those endgame builds that you're trying to go for big damage, it's going to be way more effective in the long run, and you're going to get way more damage out of him if you go ahead and build him for attack. Geo is already kind of one of the weaker elements, so they do need a little bit of help. That said, Albedo can do some serious damage if you build him correctly. But guys, that's all I got for today. Hopefully you did enjoy. If you want to see some more content from me, you can head over to my Twitch page, twitch.tv/xjazze. Stream there 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday evenings. Or if you want to support us right here on YouTube, you can go ahead and click that red subscribe button, like the video if you liked it, and hit that notification bell. That way you never miss a video. But guys, that's all I got for today. Hopefully you did enjoy, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.